Hello, I'm Rob Price. This season, we're exploring Agentic AI from the perspectives of those driving its evolution. Welcome to Futurise.
Okay, my name's Eric Broda out of Toronto, Canada, and I'm here to talk about agents. So first off, thank you very much, Rob, for having me on the show. And let me give you a quick bio, I suppose. Like I said, out of Toronto, Canada, 35 years experience, almost all in financial services. Started my career in consulting, went into industry. I guess I smartened up. I was an executive at global banks and global insurance companies. In fact, I was a global chief architect of a very large insurer. But 8 years ago, started my own company. We build ecosystems. First, it was APIs and service mesh, and it was data and data mesh. Now it's agents and what we call agentic mesh. So I do come from an enterprise background. We build enterprise systems. Now we're applying that to agents. So that's a little bit about me.
Fantastic and great to have you on the podcast at last, Eric. I think we've had a series of conversations that are very much focused around thinking about it from the enterprise perspective. So answering that question, how would I manage hordes of agents, or in an agentic mesh, in the terminology that you've just used? But before we get into that, how about just framing what does agentic AI mean from your point of view, and in the context of an agentic mesh? Just talk to us a bit about your spin on that capability.
Sure. Well, first off, obviously, AI in particular, the modern version of it with LLMs, large language models, offer a tremendous amount of ability. What we do is we merge those with agents. So the term agents implies agency and autonomy. So when you combine autonomy with AI, what you have is LLM powered agents, agents that are able to plan and execute their own tasks. And obviously, what we see is not just one agent. We see ecosystems of agents, and hence that's where we come up with agentic mesh. But we see whether it's teams probably in the next little while, all the way to what we call fleets of agents. Managed by people, all working together and interacting, collaborating, and even transacting in a broader ecosystem. So when I think of agentic AI, I think of not just the individual LLMs or the individual agents, but rather how they come together in an ecosystem.
And I mean, I was talking to a number of people in London last night, and I think I said something along the lines of we can build agent teams now. Lots of people are building agents. Lots of people have used LLMs. People are beginning to build teams. But flipping it round in terms of how do we deal with the governance of that, I think is just such a massive question, because I don't think enough people anywhere in the world are talking about it from that perspective. That's what I loved with our first conversation when we first spoke. We were both talking about it from that angle, not necessarily with all the answers yet, because I don't think
Mhm.
the answers are out there. But talk to us a bit about how you view the need to put governance around, in your terms, the agentic mesh or the fleets of agents that would be out there.
Yeah, sure. I think it's a very broad topic, and I'll address it from a few different perspectives. I think the first thing that people need to realize is that agents talk in long-running conversations. So as opposed to microservices, which would be very quick, interactions are limited, they're stateless, if you will. The fact that agents actually have long-running conversations and they're stateful, an agent may break during this long-running conversation has a very different perspective and forces you to think differently about governance. In fact, the governance, the model we apply is actually the same type of idea around governance of people and what people do, enterprise workflows, for example. So the analogs that we actually come up with around governing agents is actually we take significantly from the real world approach for governance. So let me give you an example. We tend to use a different word, actually. We call it certification of agents. And the reason we do that is, in contrast to governance of agents, is the real world model that we apply and we think works very well. It's been around for about 70, 80, maybe 100 years. In Canada and the US, in Canada, we have the Canadian Standards Association. In the US, they have Underwriters Laboratory, and I'm pretty sure there's equivalents in the UK and the EU. But effectively, what they do is they make sure that real world products like toasters, for example, won't burn your house down when you try and create, have some toast. But there's a very, very complex process. It's been done for decades now, 40, 50, maybe 80 years in certain countries, where they actually define broad level policies and they federate the accountability for determining and verifying if what those policies be, but how you can actually define successful adherence to those policies. We think that exact same model applies to agents. So we believe the term is actually certification of agents. And in that context, just like real world products, you could have inside an organization, you could have a governance team that actually verifies or certifies an agent. You could also have third parties, audit companies, or otherwise, just like in the real world, that certify that an agent actually works the way it's supposed to, adheres to its purpose. In fact, if taken to its next level, just like when I lift up the toaster, at least in Canada, when I lift up the toaster, I can actually see the brand, the CSA logo. Again, it says it's not going to burn the house down. We may see brands associated with certified agents, both inside the company and external to the company, public agents, if you will. And then we actually see probably in the next 3 to 4 years an ecosystem of certifiers, auditors, if you will, for agents. So we see that governance model changing rather significantly. And as opposed to traditional data governance, for example, as important as that is, we actually see it transform into a certification capability. Now, that does imply certain things. It implies a trust framework. It implies a trust framework that says these are the policies that this agent actually adheres to, whether it's GDPR or PII or in healthcare HIPAA, at least in North America. There needs to be a set of policies. There needs to be a transparent purpose for that agent. And all of that needs to be surfaced in a way that people can actually visualize. So imagine a person who is trying to engage an agent, whether they're inside, in the public internet or inside a company. The first thing they're going to do is say, hey, let me find it in a marketplace, perhaps. But once I found it, let me understand its purpose. Let me understand its policies, and let me understand if it's certified to work in my particular area within the enterprise. So we see trust is actually in that certification work as the one of the fundamental criteria for agent adoption. I mean, we all know if we don't trust something, we're not going to use it. And I think that applies very, very specifically to agents also.
I've now got a big question though, because if I'm using my toaster, I'm
Mhm.
pretty certain that tomorrow and next week and next month, it's still going to be a toaster. It's not going to suddenly have evolved to actually automatically dealing with the cheese and the tomato and whatever else I might want to add to it. So an agent isn't a static thing, really, is it? I mean, the construct of the agents, the way in which they operate and evolve over time. How do you see how do you see certification and trust working in an environment where at that point it may meet all the kind of policies or criteria or the things that you're testing against, but does it not have variable behaviors?
Well, first off, I think over time the answer will be yes. The folks that we talk about, although I mentioned I'm perhaps biased, I work in financial services, a heavily regulated industry. Those folks are not in the habit of saying, I want my agent to actually learn and change behavior now that it's in production. So some industries, by the way, will be different. And there is a value proposition that says my agent should actually learn from mistakes that it actually finds. But the process by which an agent changes its behavior is a attribute of governance. At least in the industries I am in, we do not want to have, for example, an agent made a mistake and it, said something bad to a customer and actually find that that somehow was missed and gets populated back into the learning cycle. That could be devastating. That has huge brand consequences. So in a certain segment of the audience, the companies that I deal with, it's actually the ability to drive consistency and repeatable behavior is actually the core. That being said, there is a school of thought that says the agents using curated, understood behavior, appropriate behavior, should be able to learn. What we found though is what that really means is two things. One is you can augment the digital exhaust, if you will, and that could become elements of the context that an agent may use, or you could use that to retrain the LLM, in which then becomes a smarter brain, if you will, for that agent. Both of those have consequences, and you need to actually do those very, very carefully. We do foresee that actually occurring, even in highly regulated industries, but there's a careful process by which that needs to go through, and I don't think most organizations are necessarily mature enough to handle those.
And I've just got to touch on one more bit because and again I'm going to go last night. I had a discussion on something along the lines of the question of do models degrade or are models variable? So if I've got a model at the heart of that agent that's certified at a point in time, can I guarantee the performance of the model that's kind of driving the behaviors of the agent in whatever way that it's being configured to do so?
Yeah, so there's an ongoing discussion around how do I actually measure whether a model degrades or not? And I think that's part of the governance mechanism. And the way we look at it is there should be tests to ensure that an agent continuously meets its purpose and meets, the policies. So when I was an executive at large banks and insurance companies, there was a regular process by which we had to attest. It was every quarter. We had to attest that these IDs attached to these people were still in my organization, but to these applications were still in my organization, and that they behaved in a way that was appropriate. Now, they were deterministic, so to speak, applications, so they didn't vary terribly much. But we actually believe that attestation, that certification is not a one-off event. It's a continuous event that you would use. Again, the analogy here or the example is an agent should be enterprise grade and should act like any other enterprise grade agent. In other words, like any enterprise grade agent, it needs to be observed, operated, and if there's some inconsistencies in its results, inaccuracies, errors, those need to be corrected. And we think that is exactly the same model that should be applied to agents. So whether the models degrade or not, that should be in some way, shape, or fashion caught in the observability operability loop.
So let's go back to the trust piece. So we'll imagine the enterprise, we'll imagine an agentic mesh, fleets of agents working in conjunction with people across that organization. They've been certified. We know they work. We know they do their job. Um, how do you look at the relationship between the people part of that team? So if you're thinking about what does a high performing team look like, where you've got people and agents, where does accountability lie for ensuring that those agents are doing the thing that they do? Is that like, I mean, to follow your analogy, managing a team of people?
Yeah, so I think the analogy is correct, and I mean, all analogies break down at some point in time, but here's my perspective. Um, agents agents must have guardrails. Okay. When it comes to accountability at the extreme, agents cannot be sued, but their owners can. Same thing within organizations. Yes, you're not going to sue your business partner here, but what you are going to do is you're going to have some level of accountability, that is not within the agent. The agent does what it is. It is empowered by the owner or the producer, the creator, if you will. And those powers, access to the other agents or access to tools, are defined by the owner. So there has to be some agent owner, and they are actually accountable for what that agent does. They're responsible for creating the guardrails. They're responsible for implementing and verifying the certification framework. They're effectively accountable for the trust embodied in that agent. So today, we believe strongly that that is still in the hands of people. Will that change, 3, 4 years from now? Maybe my crystal ball gets, quite cloudy 6 months out, let alone that long. But that's how we see it today, Rob.
And and this is maybe unfair to flip it round, but t taking your point of could it change? Could you envisage that um, an agent or agents have a responsibility to report on the performance of people. Are the people fulfilling their end of the bargain in the context of the work that's to be done?
Well, I think so. So today, whether explicitly or implicitly, regular enterprise apps do measure people. They measure applications. They measure people at the highest level. A CEO is responsible for their revenue and their cost. All of that, at least in a modern bank, but in most organizations, is supported by an army of people who manage an army of systems. So I would suggest that it does happen today. But the key here is what is the line, what is the line between the agent and the individual by which, who is being evaluated? I think the way that works is you have the agent, you have a person who's accountable for that agent, and then that accountable individual may offer some recommendations to other individuals who are being managed. In many respects, it's exactly the same way that a regular organization, and the HR department would operate today. In fact, what we see is the notion of an enterprise, an agent firm. In fact, we're working with some companies that are doing this right now. An agent firm that is managed by three or four people, but they manage fleets of 10, 100, maybe more at some point in time, of agents that actually do the real work. So is the role of the agent fleet manager that are they're managing agents, and those agents act kind of like people. So in some respects, they're doing the same equivalent of what they did with people. They're now applying it to agents. Yes, the work may be a little bit different, but nevertheless, the concept and the analogy is actually quite similar in my mind anyway.
You touched at the beginning of that answer in terms of the many, many enterprise applications that exist in many organizations already. And of course, Microsoft, Google, Amazon, SAP, Oracle. I mean, all sorts of good Salesforce, ServiceNow. We could go on and on and on, and we'd have to assume that there will be a multiplicity of agents that emerge out of each of
Mhm. Mhm.
those software providers today. Have you thought more about in that agentic mesh? Of course, there are many different providers of agents. There are many different technology stacks that those agents will exist upon. We're at the right, really at the start of the people thinking about interoperability of agents, but only really A to A has kind of been talked about in that context. What,
Mhm.
what's your thinking around an agentic mesh in the context of multiple suppliers? Because if I go back to the early days of cloud, I remember talking about interoperability of cloud and it's kind of there a bit, but it's not easy because of course people protect their space, don't they? I mean, it's not as though every provider of those systems is making it easy to just flip over tomorrow to a different space. So what are your thoughts on interoperability and an agentic mesh of many?
Yeah, so I think interoperability is the current challenge of the day. So again, as I mentioned, agents don't stand alone. They're not an island unto themselves. They're made to and built just like people to interact. So the interoperability is table stakes. We're starting to see some standards emerging. Obviously, MCP from Anthropic, Model Context Protocol. We see A to A, agent to agent from Google, and we see some stuff, really cool stuff from folks like IBM, et cetera. So we see the interoperability actually occurring quite rapidly, a lot faster than we saw with the cloud and even the internet before there. So we think that, as they say, is that's movie coming to a theater near you, as they say. But here's what we do see, and this is what we see as a challenge. Is in probably just like the cloud vendors, if you run on AWS, they make it very difficult for you to move off of AWS. And they make it tricky, not necessarily insurmountable obstacles, but they make it difficult or more challenging than it needs to be to interact with Azure or some of the other cloud providers. We see exactly the same with agents. In other words, it's early stage. So, for example, Salesforce has been a leader in agents. We think that's wonderful, by the way. An incoming tide rises, all the boats rise with an incoming tide. So we're very much encouraging that. Same thing with ServiceNow. They're doing exactly the same thing, which is they have their own proprietary approach to agents. And if you want to interact with Salesforce agents, you have to be on the Salesforce platform. And if you want to interact with ServiceNow agents, you have to be on the ServiceNow platform. You have to adopt their protocols, et cetera, et cetera. We think that's a flawed approach. It is manifestly normal for early stage, but it will change. And like I said, we see stuff A to A, MCP as is overcoming those obstacles. We do see interoperability coming. In an agentic mesh, that's table stakes. So the question is, how do we do it? We have a perspective. We use MCP predominantly, mostly because the so let me take a quick step back. When we think of agents, they are the point of collaboration or point of orchestration. Okay. So you create a task plan. The task plan has multiple steps. We have an LLM brain that identifies this agent goes to step one or this tool for step two, and then it coordinates the execution of those. The agents are the point of collaboration or orchestration, but at some point, work has to be done. Those are the tools. So the tools are the point of integration or the point of execution. So how do we actually integrate in a broader ecosystem? Well, agents will collaborate with agents. They'll create their task plan, farm off stuff to an agent. But at some point, that agent says, I need to do work. I'm going to execute a tool. So whether you use MCP or wherever MCP evolves to in the future, effectively, you're calling an API, an event, you're issuing an event, whatever the case may be. And that tool will integrate with Salesforce or CRM or ERP, or what we see commonly with my clients is integrating with their internal core banking system or their policy management system behind the firewall, if you, or integrating with the mainframe where the bulk, at least in financial services, the bulk of the core assets and the information about the organization are still maintained. So we actually see interoperability happening not necessarily directly through agents. Agents are the collaborators that break big tasks and small tasks, but they interact with tools that actually do the execution. Those tools will become the point of integration with Salesforce or Snowflake or whatever the case may be, including, for example, security. If you're talking about how do I integrate with an enterprise's security framework, minimally, you need to think about how do I integrate with mutual TLS, or how do I integrate with OAuth 2, or how do I connect with an identity book of record? All those are tools, well, some of which are tools and some of which, at least in our terminology, every agent for us has mutual TLS. Every agent has OAuth 2. Every agent is a microservice. But if we wanted to integrate with a particular identity book of record, of which banks and insurance companies have many, that's a tool integration. So there's a bunch of different ways to do it, but that's the general approach that we see evolving and almost becoming commonplace now.
So let's try and pull all that together, and I guess ask the question from the perspective of the CIO, the COO, the person who's got the responsibility for that operational environment. Um, what should they be looking at? I mean, there's a lot of terminologies that I've heard, and indeed a lot of that builds upon things like DevOps and ML ops of previously,
Mhm.
model ops, agent ops, agentic ops. What what would you point to in terms of the things to think about now?
Yeah,
Accepting it's
that's
early days. It's not like we need to solve it for 10 million agents tomorrow. Most organizations are not at that point. They are experimenting. But what should those organizations be thinking about building over the next year, 2 years to best support that agentic mesh?
sure. Let me kind of take a quick step back. So if we look at how people develop agents today, and again, by the way, this is not meant to be critical. It's meant to identify the fact that there's an opportunity to evolve. Most agents and the frameworks let you build, everything in a single Python file. Yes, I can import some stuff, but ultimately I have a single Python file and I execute it using a Python command or some variant of that, and it runs in a single operating system process. The challenge with that, first off, is as I mentioned earlier, in an ecosystem, these agents need to talk to each other. In the current tool framework, these agents can only talk with agents that are directly inside that Python file. Significant limitation. I'm not sure. I think actually that's a bridge too far for folks to apply um, uh, agent ops and get that thing into production. Yes, you can get standalone pieces, but again, that's not where companies need to go or want to go. They want to have a collaborating set of agents that are easy to not only create and easy to deploy and easy to interact. The current mode of operation with this single Python file is extremely limited. Yes, you can, augment your DevSecOps processes and get that into production. But in my terminology, that's what people call science experiments, at least the people I talk to. Those are graduated proof of concepts, but they actually don't get you to where you need to go, which is, if I believe Jensen Wang, we're going to see billions, hundreds of millions of agents. Andy Jassy just the other day said we will see billions of agents. The current architecture, the current approach will not get us to a billion agents. It will not. It cannot. It's just not instrumented to do what it needs to do. These agents are not, first off, scalable, deployable. They're not enterprise grade. So we believe strongly that to get to where we need to go, that being said, people will walk before they run, obviously, but to get to where they want to go, you need to have a different architecture. You need to go with something that everybody has known and worked with for decades, well, 15 years at least, is microservices. So we believe if you want to actually get to the point where you want to have, hundreds, thousands, tens of thousands, you do what enterprises do today when they want to deploy hundreds or thousands of instances of something. They put it into a microservice, they put that microservice into a container, and then they run it on Kubernetes or some cloud native container management orchestration system. That architecture is not what we have today. What we have done is with our customers, we have that architecture. Every agent is built into a microservice. By virtue of being a microservice, it's very easy to apply mutual TLS, OAuth 2 integration. By virtue of MCP, I can connect into an identity book of record. All of a sudden, and because it's a microservice, I can package it in a container, and then I can actually put it into literally any environment that an enterprise is comfortable with. That's the architecture that we need. That's the architecture that we find our clients are demanding, and we've been working with them to do that. Once you have that new architecture, and if you start to think about how you apply the certification and trust and capabilities like that, that requires, I would argue, a little bit of a new version of agentic ops, but one that is very, very close to what we do today. Microservices, DevSecOps, with an agentic flavor on top of it. In other words, why this is so compelling is the microservice architecture is what organizations have done for 15 years. Package them into containers they've done for the last 8 or 9 years. Putting them into Kubernetes they've been doing for the last 5 or 6 years successfully or in the cloud. Um, Putting security into these applications and applying it to agents. It's something that can be done today. Modifying an existing DevSecOps for agentic capability because of the leverage of the architecture that I just mentioned it's not trivial by any stretch, but it's not rocket science. This is the capability that we actually see organizations, big organizations, wanting to go, and that's where we've actually been instrumenting our toolkit to support that capability. That's where we see things going.
And I think, well, in a sense, what does that say? Um, it comes back to my point. We can build agent teams. By that, I mean there are people around who can build agent teams and build agents. It's a question of how we do that in a way that we can govern effectively over a decade, 2 decades, 3 decades. So how do you create that sustained experience? And I think part of that, I'll go back to your word right at the start, trust, because we have to ensure that it's trusted by the board of that business to kind of do things in a safe and secure way. We have to ensure that it's trusted by the people who use it and interact with it day to day. So it seems that trust is paramount, and the things that we're all doing are trying to kind of look at finding ways to give people that trust that yes, it can help them, but it can do so in a way that makes sense.
Absolutely. Absolutely. I think you're hitting on the key point and I think trust is an umbrella term that implies a whole bunch of things. First off, if I just look simplistically at a tech stack, again, I apply trust in the context of enterprise applications. Minimally, it should be secure. So that technical level of security, whether it's mutual TLS or otherwise, it should then, have a purpose and a transparent purpose, and it should be verified against that, so be certified. Then we should be able to monitor and observe what that thing does. And when it breaks, we should be able to understand why it broke and be able to diagnose that. That explainability is crucial. So trust, we think, is almost a stack of principles layered on top of each other. And without, I think there's like 5 or 6 levels in our trust framework. If you're missing one, you have a significant, if not insurmountable gap or obstacle in trust. So we actually see trust, as you highlighted, as the fundamental criteria, but we look at it in a multifaceted way, as opposed to governance in isolation or security in isolation. We see it as a multifaceted capability, all of which, by the way, is needed to engender the trust we need to allow agents to do what we think they actually will be able to do.
Absolutely. So, Eric, every time we speak, I'm conscious that we could go on for at least twice as long as we have talked. But we're going to kind of have to kind of bring it to an end there. It's been a pleasure to talk to you again, and thank you very much for joining the podcast.
Likewise, Rob, thanks for having me.